From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The U.S. nears its $31 trillion debt ceiling as House Republicans weigh a plan to prioritize debt payments in the event that a deal can't be reached. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen told Congress in a letter on Friday that on Thursday, January 19th, the outstanding debt of the United States is projected to reach the statutory limit, unquote. That limit is $31.381 trillion. The actual deadline for congressional action is a little later this spring as the Treasury begins to take what Yellen called extraordinary measures to prevent the United States from defaulting on its obligations, unquote. Let's start today with a clip of Kentucky Congressman James Comer on CNN on Sunday discussing how Republicans intend to move forward here.
Well, we hope that this is avoided. We hope that the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, will agree to spending cuts. Look, this has to stop. We cannot continue to operate with these types of deficits. Our national debt is one of our biggest threats to our national security. China continues to have leverage over us because of the basic financial strength of their overall economy versus ours with respect to the national debt. So Republicans were elected with a mandate from the American people in the midterm elections. We campaigned on the fact that we were going to be serious about spending cuts. So the Senate's going to have to recognize the fact that we're not going to budge until we see meaningful reform with respect to spending.
Kim, what's your read of the beginning of this negotiation in Congress over raising the U.S. debt ceiling?
Well, we have a situation where we have a new Republican House, and as was just expressed, their top worry is out of control spending. By the way, they're right. We have had out of control spending. There's a couple of problems here, though, at a top line, which is that, one, the White House has said it's not going to budge on this, that it doesn't want to negotiate over this. And by the way, this is something that Democrat White Houses always try to say. They don't want to set a precedent for negotiating on this because they don't want to get locked into any spending cuts as a price of raising the debt ceiling. But one problem they have is that Obama did budge on that back in 2011. So a precedent of sorts has been set. And this is what Republicans are looking at. The other problem, though, is that Republicans, while they do hold the House, they only own that one portion of government. And something would have to be crafted in which a Democratic Senate and a Democratic White House agreed. And so far, there is no indication that they intend to do so. So we've seen this script before in a way. We've seen Republicans attempt to get tough with Democratic presidencies by holding up the debt limit and saying they will not go ahead with it unless there are spending cuts. And the problem, again, that they have, though, is that if nothing is agreed to, nothing is reached, there is the threat of default, even though these are spending that we've already done. And this is a legal contract, and we do need to keep those payments going.
Some of the things that the Treasury is now doing or will soon start doing include redeeming investments of the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Fund and the Postal Service Retiree Health Benefits Fund, and suspending new investments of those. And then after the debt limit is raised, as it seems like it inevitably will be, those retirement funds can be paid back. So the Treasury is doing some shuffling around of its financial obligations. But I would just like to underline the point that Kim just made, and I think it looms large in any conversation about the debt ceiling, which is this is debt for obligations that Congress has already approved. This is money that has already been spent. And so occasionally when you get into these conversations, there are some people who propose that the debt ceiling should be raised an incredible amount, essentially, so that it will never be hit or that it should be eliminated. Because if Congress is going to spend the money, if it's going to appropriate the money, there's an implied promise in that legislation to pay whatever debt is needed to make good on that spending.
Yeah, Kyle, I mean, how many of these debt ceiling predictions have we lived through where there's predictions of catastrophe Congress ultimately gets a deal, but there is no restraint on spending. It's just the same exercise over and over again. So that does make one sympathetic to a different process. But I do think that the core issue here, as we know, is an entitlement spending. It's more than 2/3 of the share of spending that the government does. And until we address that, we're going to be living through some of these same exercises where we continue to raise the debt ceiling. Now, on that point, though, I do think perhaps if Republicans had an ask here or a plan, or they could highlight maybe we're going to freeze a couple of these accounts until, for instance, we know how much COVID money is out there, or we're going to limit spending increases at a few departments to this percent year over year. Some discrete asks would, I think, be harder for Democrats to propose. But that's really about all I can imagine on a majority as thin as Republicans are, because you have to keep in mind you will lose some moderates on the other side if you do what Chip Roy and some of the others want to do and hold spending, to fiscal 22 levels across the government. I'm sympathetic to that effort, but it has a math problem right now. So I think what we could see here is Republicans do what they've unfortunately done several times over, which is try to take this hostage, but then not be willing to go through with it. And ultimately, the ceiling gets raised, no entitlement reform, no spending restraint, and we just wait for this to happen again the next time.
But it seems like some Republicans in the House are trying to underscore that they are serious about this. And President Biden's position, of course, is going to be that raising the debt limit is a basic obligation of responsible governance. And so it's not a point of negotiation, and that the outcomes, if the debt limit were not raised and if the U.S. defaulted on some of its debt, are so bad that eventually Republicans will go along with that. But Kim, I wonder what you make of the news recently. This is a Washington Post story saying that House Republicans are preparing a plan telling the Treasury Department what to do if Congress and the White House don't agree to lift the nation's debt limit later this year. And reportedly, one of the things that would be prioritized for payment is the debt itself, and other government obligations would be sidelined by that plan. I mean, what do you make of this? The intent of this could be to make clear to President Biden and Chuck Schumer and other Democrats that Republicans are serious about this. And there is a fallback plan if there is no deal reached.
The first thing to understand is that this is a messaging exercise that Republicans are going through with. But by the way, I think it's an important one if they are indeed serious about this. They can come up with a plan directing Treasury how to prioritize its spending in the event that it can't make all of its payments. But even if it passes it, it's not likely to be accepted by the Senate, and it would surely be vetoed by the White House. So the purpose of this is instead to try to explain to the public what kind of games might be going on here. Because if we are nearing the debt limit, the thing that the White House is going to warn is, oh my gosh, if we hit the debt limit, seniors are not going to get their Social Security payments and are no longer going to have access to Medicare funds, and veterans are not going to get their money, and really doom and gloom. And what the Republicans are attempting to do here is say, no, given the amount of money that continues to come into the U.S. Treasury, the revenues that flow, given the amount of spending that exists, you have the ability to cut off certain programs, let them falter, but still continue to make your interest payments, give money to Social Security, give money to Medicare, give money to veterans benefits. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to still be things that would get shut off in that scenario, because there isn't going to be enough money to go around if you hit the debt ceiling and Treasury can't operate without borrowing more. So you already see the White House, in particular Ron Klain, coming out saying, see, Republicans are coming up with this prioritization plan, and they care more about paying off interest to foreign bondholders than they do about kids' school lunches or national parks or border security, et cetera. So the White House is trying to say, even if we went along with them and we did this interest payments and Social Security and Medicare and the biggies, these are all the other things that would nonetheless have to go away if we hit the debt limit and they don't raise it. So again, it's part of the whole war on words, but it's about both sides trying to frame what's at stake here.
But if this is a messaging bill, I wonder if it is sending a great message for the GOP. If, as Kim says, this prioritization plan can't get through the Senate anyway, you're just giving Democrats and a guy like Ron Klain the opportunity to point to the programs that you would essentially have come to a stop in the event that the debt limit is not raised. Another one that Ron Klain highlights is food safety inspections. And I'm sure you could go through a long list of government programs that sound great and sympathetic and important and are not part of this GOP prioritization plan. Kate, I think the fundamental problem here is Kevin McCarthy's slim majority. And let's listen to another clip. Here we have Congressman Don Bacon on MSNBC this Sunday talking about the fact that negotiation is going to have to happen in order to get the debt ceiling raised.
This was a fight to see who has control of the 222 Republicans 2 weeks ago. We had 5 or 6 people that wanted to say they were in charge, when 200 were saying, no, this is where we're at. Now, I've led teams in combat, commanded 5 times, deployed 4 times. Even an imperfect team, you got to pull together and work together. And we had a small handful that wanted to demand what the rest do. That's not how it should work. Inflation has outpaced wage increases. So the standard of living for Americans have gone down. And I will encourage our side of the aisle, but I also encourage President Biden to sit down and talk through this debt ceiling increase. He says he refuses to negotiate. People on our side want 100% of what they want, and that's not going to work either way.
And Kate, the worry that he seems to be raising here is that I take your point that if Republicans were all on board and they had a plan for some strategic thing they wanted as part of the debt ceiling deal, some cut to spending that seemed reasonable to demand of the Democratic Senate, and you could go to the public and sell that and make that part of the public messaging, then that would make sense to me as a Republican strategy. But the worry is that you're going to have 5 or 10 or 15 Republicans in the House who want something really large, something that the Democratic Senate is not going to give them. And then it puts Kevin McCarthy in a really difficult spot. Does he need to turn to Democratic votes in order to get the debt ceiling raised?
Right. I mean, to the point about the politics of the prioritization plan, I think those would be brutal for Republicans. If you think back to the kind of shutdown showdowns that were common in 2011 and later over, for instance, the Affordable Care Act, the Republicans really bore a lot of blame for shutting down the government. And if you recall, when the Democrats control the executive branch, they can influence how painful those shutdowns are. And that doesn't work in Republicans' favor here either. I think to your point about food safety, a spate of stories that food is going uninspected or baby formula or something to that nature would be very damaging and not good for Republicans. But I think it goes back to, if they had a plan, if they had a way out of this where they had an ask that they all agreed on, I think that would be something that they could get some negotiation on. I mean, I think the White House is basically saying we refuse to negotiate, but of course they would if they perceive that they needed to. Here, they think they can win by simply waiting them out because the House Republicans don't have an ask even among themselves. So I think this is, again, just shaping up to be a political loser for Republicans, which is unfortunate because I do think public opinion on the debt is shifting toward concern about it. And I also think we need to talk more about, for instance, how net interest on the debt is going to outpace defense spending as a share of GDP. It is a real substantive problem, and I think the public understands that. But I don't think this process is proving to be a productive exercise in doing anything about it. And the GOP will have to look for other strategies. I think the appropriations process would be a prime one, obviously, to look for cuts and look for improvements.